In the summer of 1794, Paris was a city choking on fear. The sound of drums, the rattle of carts, and the dull thud of the guillotine had become the daily soundtrack of life. And at the heart of this machinery of death stood one man, Maximilien Robespierre, known as the Incorruptible. He was a figure who inspired both reverence and terror. His name carried a weight that could silence conversations, end friendships, and condemn lives. For under his reign, the guillotine was not simply an execution device. It was an altar on which France sacrificed thousands in the name of virtue and revolution. The irony, of course, would become history's cruelest twist. On July 28, 1794, Robespierre himself, the architect of the Reign of Terror, would be dragged before the same blade he had sanctified. With his jaw shattered, unable to deliver the fiery words that had once sealed the fate of kings, queens, and commoners alike, he entered silence, and silence became his final testimony. But how did a provincial lawyer, a man of modest origins from Arras, climb from obscurity to become the most feared man in France? To understand the brutality of his end, we must first retrace the dark path of his beginning. The spark of revolution. The French Revolution erupted in 1789 amid famine, financial ruin, and centuries of injustice. The monarchy of King Louis XVI stood bankrupt while the common people starved. Bread, the staple of life, was scarce and absurdly expensive. The old feudal order priests, nobles, and kings teetered on collapse. It was in this chaos that Robespierre rose, a 30-year-old lawyer who spoke the language of the people. He was inspired by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, particularly the idea of the general will. In his mind, the revolution was not merely about politics. It was a moral crusade, a chance to purify society of corruption, greed, and privilege. At first he was admired. Robespierre defended the poor with eloquence and conviction. He opposed the death penalty for ordinary crimes, demanded equality before the law, and rejected the privileges of the nobility. But as the revolution radicalized, so too did he. From liberty to terror, what began as a demand for constitutional monarchy soon evolved into a republic, and then into something far darker. By 1793, France was at war with nearly every major European power. At home, rebellion flared in regions like the Vendée, while Paris simmered with hunger and paranoia. The revolutionary government, the Committee of Public Safety, declared that terror would be the order of the day. Robespierre's philosophy fused morality with blood. He declared that terror is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. In his mind, executions were not excesses. They were necessities. They were the only way to preserve the fragile dream of liberty. And so, the guillotine became his chosen instrument. The national razor invented by Dr. Joseph Fignes. Guillotine as a supposedly humane alternative to older brutal methods. The guillotine promised equality in death. Nobles and peasants, priests and soldiers, women and children, all would bow to the same blade. But under Robespierre's reign, the guillotine became more than a tool. It became a symbol of the revolution's hunger for purity. It stood in the Place de la Révolution, like a grotesque idol, its posts painted red, the blade gleaming in the sun. Each day, carts of prisoners rattled through the streets, drums pounding to drown out cries, as spectators gathered to feast on the spectacle of death. From September 1793 to July 1794, a period known as the Reign of Terror, more than 17,000 people were officially executed, with tens of thousands more dying in prisons or massacres. On some days, the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, dispatched dozens, his assistants cleaning the blade, stacking the bodies, and hauling away blood-soaked straw like butchers in a slaughterhouse. The guillotine was relentless, impartial, and omnipresent. But it was Robespierre who gave it purpose. The machinery of death. Robespierre himself never pulled the rope or held the knife. His power was subtler, colder. Each morning, from his modest quarters, he reviewed lists of names, citizens denounced by neighbors, rivals accused by rivals, voices too loud, too quiet, too cautious, or too bold. His neat, precise handwriting sent thousands to their graves. Trials became a grotesque parody of justice. Defense attorneys were abolished. Evidence was irrelevant. The Revolutionary Tribunal, reorganized under Robespierre's influence, delivered only to possible outcomes: acquittal or death. And acquittal grew increasingly rare. The law of suspects meant anyone could be arrested for showing insufficient enthusiasm for the revolution. Fear seeped into every home, every conversation. Children reported parents. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. A careless sigh, a doubtful glance, even mourning the loss of an executed friend, could be enough to summon the guillotine. This was Robespierre's true genius, not in bloodlust, but in systematizing suspicion. He built a society where everyone was both spy and suspect, predator and prey, faces of the guillotine. Victims of Robespierre's terror spanned every class and creed. Marie Antoinette, once Queen of France, was reduced to a mere widow, her hands bound as she was carted through jeering crowds. Her final words were not of defiance, but an apology for accidentally stepping on the executioner's foot. Georges Danton, Robespierre's former ally, thundered in court, demanding, "Show me my crimes." But words could not save him. Dragged to the scaffold, he told the executioner, "Don't forget to show my head to the people. It's worth seeing." Madame Roland, condemned for moderation, declared from the scaffold, "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" Before the blade silenced her. Even children were not spared. 14-year-old Marie-Jeanne Beau was executed for crying when her parents were arrested. And still, the blade fell. The atmosphere of fear. By early 1794, Paris had become a haunted city. Streets were silent, not from peace, but from terror. People avoided gatherings, avoided speaking, avoided even thinking out loud. To live was to mask one's thoughts, to bow in silence to the specter of the guillotine. Foreign observers were horrified. British spies and American diplomats described a city suffocating under its own revolution. Even committed revolutionaries lived like prisoners in their own homes, waiting for the knock at the door. By the spring of 1794, Maximilien Robespierre stood at the height of his power. He had outmaneuvered rivals, silenced dissent, and remade the revolution in his image. The guillotine, once a tool of justice, was now the iron jaw of his authority. And yet, beneath the surface of his control, cracks were forming. Robespierre had become the embodiment of the revolution's terror, but terror does not inspire loyalty. It breeds silence, submission, and, eventually, rebellion. The cult of virtue. Robespierre was not content with political domination. He sought to reshape the very soul of France. To him, the revolution was not just about destroying monarchy. It was about purging vice, immorality, and corruption from society. On June 8, 1794, he presided over the Festival of the Supreme Being, a strange and theatrical ceremony meant to replace Catholicism with a civic religion of reason and virtue. Robespierre, dressed in a sky-blue coat, walked at the head of the procession like a high priest of revolution. He spoke of purity, of the general will, of a France reborn through sacrifice. But to many of his colleagues in the National Convention, the sight was unsettling. The man who now called himself the defender of liberty seemed to be constructing a cult and placing himself at its center. In whispers, some began to see not the incorruptible revolutionary, but a dictator in priestly robes. Enemies within. The more power Robespierre accumulated, the more paranoid he became. He had already sent former allies, like Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, to the guillotine. Their crime: advocating moderation, daring to suggest that perhaps the revolution had claimed enough blood. Now, no one was safe. Even members of the Committee of Public Safety, his own colleagues, lived in fear that Robespierre might denounce them as enemies of virtue. He rarely named names, but his speeches dripped with threats, shadowy references to traitors lurking in their midst. Each speech sent shivers through the convention. Who would be next? The last straw. By July 1794, the terror had reached unbearable extremes. The prisons overflowed. Executions grew ever more frequent. Food shortages gnawed at the city. And still, Robespierre demanded vigilance, demanded more purges, more death. On July 26th, he delivered what would be his final speech to the National Convention. His voice thin and sharp, accused unnamed members of conspiracy, of treachery against the revolution, but he refused to identify them. This was his fatal mistake. By casting suspicion on everyone, he united them all against him. The deputies, once cowed into silence, now realized that their survival depended on Robespierre's downfall. The coup of Thermidor the next day, July 27th, 1794, the 9th of Thermidor by the revolutionary calendar, the convention turned. As Robespierre rose to speak, he was shouted down. Cries of "Down with the tyrant" echoed through the hall. The incorruptible, who had silenced so many with his words, suddenly found himself voiceless. His authority evaporated in an instant. He and his allies were declared outlaws. Armed men stormed the Hotel de Ville, where Robespierre and his supporters had barricaded themselves. Chaos erupted. Shots were fired. In the confusion, Robespierre was struck in the jaw by a bullet. Whether fired by a gendarme or by his own hand remains uncertain. Blood poured from the wound, silencing forever the voice that had condemned thousands. Dragged half-dead from the hotel, his jaw shattered, his face smeared in blood, Robespierre was laid on a table, writhing in agony. The next day, he was taken to the guillotine. The silence of the guillotine on July 28, 1794. Maximilien Robespierre, once the most feared man in France, was carted through the streets he had filled with blood. The crowd, which once cowered at his name, now jeered. Some laughed at the sight of his bandaged, broken face. Others spat. Still others cheered, not out of love for liberty, but out of relief. Relief that the nightmare was ending. At the scaffold, Robespierre's head was strapped in place. He tried to speak, perhaps one final defense, perhaps a curse, perhaps a plea, but the ruined jaw could form no words. His last gift from the revolution was silence. The blade fell. The incorruptible was no more. As his head was lifted, the crowd erupted in thunderous applause. For the first time in months, Paris felt the grip of fear loosen. The revolution had devoured its darkest prophet. Aftermath of the terror. Robespierre's death marked more than the fall of a man. It marked the collapse of the reign of terror itself. The Revolutionary Tribunal was dismantled. The daily executions stopped. Prisoners were released. The guillotine, once the engine of politics, was finally quiet. But the scars remained. France was left haunted by the memory of neighbors betraying neighbors, of children denouncing parents, of liberty drowned in rivers of blood. Economically, the country lay in ruins. The assignats, revolutionary paper currency, were worthless. Trade had collapsed. Skilled artisans had fled or been executed. Hunger still stalked the streets. The revolution's promise of prosperity had become a wasteland of fear and want. Legacy of blood. Robespierre's methods left a legacy far beyond France. His belief that terror could be an instrument of virtue, that extraordinary times justified extraordinary cruelty, would echo through centuries. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, all would invoke similar logic. His system of surveillance, denunciations, and preventive arrests foreshadowed the machinery of modern police states. His use of fear as a political weapon became a template for dictators to come. The revolution had promised liberty, equality, fraternity, Under Robespierre, it delivered suspicion, silence, and death. The human face of tyranny. What makes Robespierre's story so chilling is not that he was a monster, but that he was a man. He believed in justice, in equality, in virtue. He believed he was cleansing France of corruption, and yet, in his hands, justice became murder, equality became conformity, and virtue became tyranny. The incorruptible had been corrupted, not by greed, but by his own righteousness. In the end, he was not slain by kings or nobles, but by his fellow revolutionaries. The revolution had turned on itself. The blade he worshipped claimed him as its final, symbolic victim. A warning across time. The guillotine that fell on Robespierre's neck is more than a relic of history. It is a warning, a reminder that even noble causes can birth nightmares, that the pursuit of purity can become indistinguishable from cruelty, and that the greatest danger to liberty often comes from those who claim to defend it. The revolution sought to free the people of France, yet it bound them in chains of fear. Robespierre sought to build a republic of virtue, yet he filled it with blood. On that July day in 1794, as his silence echoed across Paris, one truth became clear. The revolution had consumed its own children, and its most zealous disciple was now its most fitting sacrifice. For Robespierre, none of this was cruelty. It was virtue. The revolution, he declared, must purge itself of weakness, of doubt, of corruption. And so, the lists grew longer. The prisons swelled. The blade never rested.